On March 10, 2018, St. Paul's Episcopal Church in Richmond, Virginia, hosted Bending Toward Truth, a forum on race and religion in Richmond. The forum was presented by the St. Paul's History and Reconciliation Initiative, which was formed, in the words of its mission statement, that in light of our Christian faith, we will trace and acknowledge the racial history of St. Paul's Episcopal Church in order to repair, restore, and seek reconciliation with God, each other, and the broader community. Part 1, Bending Toward Truth, a forum on race and religion in Richmond. Race and Religion in Richmond History, 1844 to 1902. In Part 1, Linda Armstrong, Chair of the HRI Steering Committee, introduces the speakers. Doctors Christopher Graham and Elizabeth O'Leary, St. Paul's congregants, present a summary of the findings of the History and Research Committee of the St. Paul's History and Reconciliation Initiative. The focus of their research has been the Church's culture and activities regarding slavery and race. Comments on their presentation follow from Doctors Corey Walker, Nicole Myers-Turner, and Edward Ayers.
Good afternoon. I'm Linda Armstrong. I'm chair of the History and Reconciliation Initiative here at St. Paul's Episcopal Church. I want to extend to you all a happy welcome to our church. We're delighted that you made a choice to spend a few hours with us today, and we hope you'll join us tomorrow morning at our 10 a.m. service where Bishop Curry will speak. Tomorrow, remember, spring forward tonight, 10 a.m. service. Don't forget the clock. Our special guest this afternoon, the Most Reverend Michael Curry, the presiding bishop of the Episcopal Church. Would you just stand up and say hey? And the Very Reverend Shannon Johnston, Bishop of the Diocese of Virginia. Now, a quick introduction to all of those you're going to hear before you get your dinner. So bear with me. Dr. Christopher Graham, a St. Paul's parishioner and chair of the History and Research Committee. Chris is currently the guest curator at the American Civil War Museum in Richmond, and he came here from the University of North Carolina at Greensboro, where he was an assistant professor. Dr. Elizabeth O'Leary, wave. Also a St. Paul's parishioner and a researcher for the History and Research Committee, is a retired associate curator of American art at the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts. She's a graduate of the University of Tennessee and holds an MA and a PhD from the University of Virginia. Dr. Corey Walker is Vice President of Virginia Union University and Dean of the Samuel DeWitt Proctor School of Theology. After a career in the world of finance, Dr. Walker earned a Master of Divinity degree from the Proctor School, of which he is now Dean. He has a Master of Theological Studies from Harvard Divinity and a PhD in American Studies from William & Mary. Dean Walker is an ordained American Baptist clergyman. Dr. Nicole Myers-Turner, on the end, Assistant Professor of African History at Virginia Commonwealth University. She also has a Master's in Divinity from Union Theological in New York, and her MA and PhD from the University of Pennsylvania. At Penn, she began the study of the intersection between Black religion and politics in the post-emancipation period. Dr. Ed Ayers, the President Emeritus of the University of Richmond, is presently the Tucker Boatwright Professor of Humanities at UR. Previously, he was Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences at UVA. He agreed in 2015 to serve as their lead historian for this effort, and we're grateful for all his help. A historian of the American South, he has written and edited 11 books. Among numerous awards, honors, prizes, he was awarded the National Humanities Medal in 2013 by President Obama. Chris and Beth will be presenting today an incomplete overview of St. Paul's history and they hope you understand that there's so much more than what you'll hear. This quick survey represents the research of nearly a dozen St. Paul's members, many of you in this sanctuary, but they want to especially recognize the work of Ann Hayes and Ann Snyder. Are you here? Are they in here? We recognize your work. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Members of Richmond's monumental church, desiring a place on fashionable Grace Street, built St. Paul's in 1844. We simply do not know to what extent the building contractors used enslaved labor on this place. Builders in Richmond routinely use enslaved, free black, and white workers together, and that's likely the case here. But we didn't uncover anything, names, ages, numbers, about the use of enslaved people in the construction of this church. And that is just as well, because while I believe that acknowledging enslaved workers on this building is important, looking for them distracts from other things. This is less about how slavery built this church and more about how the people of this church built race in Richmond. St. Paul's came into life as the larger white Southern Protestant world defined how they would be good Christians and hold slaves at the same time. They sacralized a narrative of racial difference and mutual obligation that lived with us long after the end of slavery. In the years before the Civil War, white Christians waged their souls by the terms of pro-slavery Christianity. In Richmond now, we rightly feature the domestic slave trade centered at Shockoe Bottom. This contemporary focus on traders, jails, and profits is necessary, but it is not necessarily where St. Paul's intersects with slavery. And what I mean to say is that is that in our search of early congregants, we could not identify any slave trader among St. Paul's members, and only two engaged tangentially in the slave insurance and brokering business. This is not a deflection, but an opportunity to expand our vision of what slavery in Richmond looked like beyond Shockoe Bottom in spiritual as well as material forms. Slavery dominated the city's great industries commanded by St. Paul's members. In the 1850s, enslaved workers composed almost 50% of Richmond's factory workforce. The pioneer of industrial slave labor in the South was Joseph Reed Anderson, founding vestryman at St. Paul's, who owned Tredegar Iron Works and 75 slaves. Bowling Haxall owned the Haxall Flour Mill and used over 29 in his enterprises. James Dunlop, president of Coal Mines and Railroads, routinely partnered with William McFarland, president of the Farmers Bank, to endorse and employ slave insurers and slave hiring brokers. Most St. Paul's members worked in medicine, law, and as merchants, meaning their primary encounter with slavery was in the use of enslaved people in their own households to cook, do laundry, care for children, and drive coaches. Families at St. Paul's tended to own as few as 2 and as many as 18 men, women, and children, averaging about 5 per household. We see St. Paul's people engaged in domestic slavery in their advertisements to rent and hire black people. Mary and Charles Barney solicited for a well-recommended dining room servant for their Main Street home, while Miles George advertised to rent out a small girl suitable for a nurse. Slave owners like these at St. Paul's administered a system that demanded work and obedience from black people, a system that enforced these demands with violence and routinely separated families. Yet these slave owners preferred to tell themselves and occasionally act on the idea that they were benevolent masters. Thomas Ellis, St. Paul's Register, Joseph Reed Anderson, and Bowling Haxall, for instance, signed on to an 1852 clemency petition for an enslaved tobacco factory worker who had killed his supervisor. Later, St. Paul's rector, Charles Minnegroda, requested clemency for 2 enslaved men, Oliver and George, the latter Minnegroda had hired, who allegedly burgled his house in 1865 and were condemned to death. Cases like these gave slaveholders the opportunity to demonstrate their capacity for mercy within a legal relationship that required none, in a social order that demanded violence. And the hardest thing to grasp is that these white men and women defined their mastery not as violence and hatred, but as acts of benevolence and love. And they used religion as a way to make that notion sacred. This is pro-slavery Christianity. In short, white Christians found the Bible to be fully supportive of slavery. It is, after all, full of references to patriarchs, slaves in their households, and instructions on how to properly keep them and keep them focused on God. More pointedly, Jesus said a lot of things, but he never commanded his followers to free slaves, while the Apostle Paul did explicitly command slaves to obey their masters in all things. Biblical justification for slavery was easy, but what pro-slavery Christians did with it is what is relevant to us. God's prescription for slavery, as they understood it, demanded unequal race relations and defined a program of action. Pro-slavery Christians believed that master and slave should submit themselves together to God and that God looked upon them equally. Here on earth, though, that relationship was unequal because in their minds, the minds of the white masters, white people possessed the capacity for moral superiority and black people possessed the capacity only for degeneracy and helplessness. And with that being the alleged case, white people had a God-given obligation to morally instruct black people. And it's not a static thing. There's a logic of progress here. Richmond Episcopalian Sarah Valentine boldly articulated her pro-slavery Christianity in 1860. God had commanded souls from heathen lands, she wrote, and, quote, God hath in a mysterious union forever united the master and slave. Man may not, man cannot put them asunder. When the great day on which all hearts shall stand revealed arrives, we shall not tremble at the thought that we enslaved our brother. But if we have neglected to observe the meaning of that providence that led us thus to act, then we shall find ourselves indeed unprofitable servants to the best of masters. Irrevocable, then, will be our doom. Thus, pro-slavery Christians never thought to abolish slavery. They only worked in their minds for the annihilation of the evils of slavery, and that's a quote. Those evils being slaveholders who didn't care for the spiritual development of their enslaved people. They didn't apologize for slavery. They were proud of it. They didn't use it as a transparent cover for economic gain. It was not a balm for a nagging conscience. They genuinely believed that God blessed racial inequality and slavery, and that any attempt to force its end was an abrogation of God's will. How did they fulfill what they described as God's obligation? Religious white people across denominations created what they called the mission to the slaves, or what the Diocese of Virginia called religious instruction of the colored people. These initiatives used catechisms, hymns, and sermons to create an environment in which enslaved people could encounter proper, or white, Christianity. In the early 1850s, the diocese published a book titled Plain Sermons for Servants, containing 36 sermons on such topics as God's wondrous love to sinners, and sermons designed for masters and slaves together that describe their mutual obligations, masters to teach, slaves to accept and obey those teachings. Whites' paternalism and blacks' subjection, then, were Christian acts in the minds of pro-slavery Christians. A sacred relationship and a sacred obligation, they thought, necessary to their religious fulfillment. From 1845, when St. Paul's opened its doors, it provided seating for black people during services, the pews up in the Western Gallery. In 1847, Reverend Norwood reported a Sunday school for black children with up to 150 in attendance. But it was only that year, and the reason for its single appearance is unknown. By comparison, St. James Episcopal Church, just a few blocks over, had a well-attended Sunday school every year before the Civil War. And this is interesting, this waxing and waning of Sunday school attendance, the failure at St. Paul's to attract, and the successes at St. James, as it opens up an intriguing thing. The autonomy and choice common in black religion in Richmond. Likely, St. Paul's West Gallery was filled with nurses and drivers of white congregants on Sundays, but white Christians in urban areas rarely compelled enslaved blacks to choose their masters' churches. Indeed, many of the people owned by St. Paul's congregants were members of some of Richmond's black churches. Samuel P. Mitchell, a St. Paul's member, for instance, owned Charles Matthews, the choir director at Ebenezer African Church. William McFarland, St. Paul's senior warden, owned Mary Robinson, a First African Baptist member, and Abraham Warwick claimed ownership of at least 4 First African members. While black people flooded into Baptist and Methodist churches in Richmond, they avoided Episcopal churches. St. Paul's stood as a prime example. Between 1846 and 1860, St. Paul's never reported more than 5 people of color as communicants. Those were John Hilton, Margaret Tyler, John Davis, Walker Wilson, and Nancy Scott. Nancy Scott was a free woman, as she had been arrested once for not having her papers. Otherwise, nothing is known about these communicants, and besides Scott, not even their status as free or enslaved people. Black enthusiasm for First African Baptists and decided disinterested in the Protestant Episcopal Church deeply troubled the white Episcopalian paternalists, convinced that white supervision of black religion was ordained by God. By the late 1850s, this observation that black people didn't come to Episcopal churches prompted a number of searching and revealing discussions within Episcopal circles. The Diocese of Virginia convened a committee in 1860 to consider how to attract more black people. The committee reviewed a checklist of why they thought black people might not show up, and then explained away everything. We allow them space. Our sermons are simple and accessible. The Book of Common Prayer is as plain as it can be. And we'll do a full immersion baptism if they'd ask. But no one asked for these things. The committee then made a remarkable observation. What do the Baptists and Methodists offer that we don't? Quote, "This we believe to be the blessed privilege of Christian fellowship." Reviewing Episcopal practice, the committee wondered, quote, "What provision is made so far as colored persons are concerned?" "Very little indeed," they concluded. Quote, "Once a month, after the sacrament of the Lord's Supper has been administered to other communicants, some indication is given to them as they wait in some part of the gallery that they may approach to receive the consecrated symbol of salvation and of Christian union. And then they retire as they came, unknowing and unknown. There is nothing to make them feel that they have any relationship to the Christian people where they worship." This committee then had accurately diagnosed the problem of black indifference to white Episcopal churches, at least as best as they could. The distance created by paternalism and inequality and slavery had created impassable gulfs in Christian fellowship. They asked, to provide this for them among ourselves then is the problem. How can it be done? In this moment of clarity, these clergymen faltered. They wanted to draw black people into fellowship, but they could not bring themselves to fellowship with black people. They noted, quote, "These conditions have grown out of the obvious proprieties of the case and may not be changed." Proprieties of the case evidently refers to the necessity of performing secular racial etiquette. As much as they wanted masters and slaves to worship together, white and black parishioners approaching the communion rail together would be an intolerable concession to social equality. Earthly matters trumped spiritual ones. The committee decided that the best way to secure black membership in the Episcopal Church was that, quote, "we must give them their own stated and separate service." This troubled them because they would rather have had black members in their pews, but they knew that the earthly divide made that impossible. A committee of Richmond Episcopalians anticipated the diocesan conclusions and met in the basement of St. Paul's, right beneath us right now, to discuss how to proceed with the establishment of a separate black congregation. Reverend Minigorode opened the meeting. St. Paul's member Thomas Ellis served as secretary, while congregants John Steger and Samuel P. Mitchell sat at the table. John Steger rose to endorse the establishment of an African Episcopal church in Richmond. That African Episcopal church later became St. Philip's, but the immediate effort stalled as other public events took priority. While Richmond Episcopalians fretted over the implication of separating the children of God by race, they absolutely could not abide external political force that attacked the assumptions of their sacred relationship. Abolitionist attacks on slavery did just that. Sarah Valentine believed that, quote, "God hath forever united the master and slave," but now Republicans threatened that sacred bond, and religious people took arms to protect it.
We can't overstate the impact of the Civil War on St. Paul's. The brutal conflict defined the church's identity, and it shaped its appearance. In the half-century that followed, the people of St. Paul's navigated the altered political and social landscape of post-emancipation Virginia. Looking through the nostalgic lens of the lost cause, they helped shape a new South where they flourished and in which African Americans became increasingly constrained by law and custom. By proximity, St. Paul's was well positioned to become the de facto national cathedral of the Confederacy. In the shadow of the state capitol, and with a membership that included many of the Commonwealth's leading citizens, the church became a prominent hub of activity. William McFarland, St. Paul's senior warden, served as a delegate to the Virginia Secession Convention, and as such, he helped draft the Ordinance of Secession. Once the Confederate government moved to Richmond in May 1861, attendance at St. Paul's soared. Over the next 4 years, the sanctuary brimmed with Confederate luminaries, foremost being President Jefferson Davis and Commanding General Robert E. Lee. The people of St. Paul's were fully invested in the rebellion, emotionally, financially, and spiritually. Dozens of congregants fought in the army. By the church's estimation, over 30 died in battle. Others returned maimed, some of them missing limbs. On the home front, St. Paul's Undercroft functioned as an occasional hospital ward. Women of the church served as volunteer nurses, and they also operated a Soldiers' Aid Society, sending items to the troops. We know very little about wartime experiences of African Americans associated with St. Paul's parishioners, but we catch glimpses of their challenging lives through archives and news clippings. In Bowling Haxel's papers are listings of individuals he purchased, sold, and rented out. In 1863, he noted the escape of Abraham, quote, to the Yankees, I believe. Joseph Reed Anderson posted frequent advertisements in the Daily Dispatch when his laborers ran away from his munitions plant. In 1862, listing $200 for the capture of 5 who escaped together. The following year, we read about, quote, Moses, slave of J.R. Anderson, ordered 5 lashes for smoking a cigar on the street. Now, the fate of these individuals is lost to history. Posterity leaves full accounting, however, about St. Paul's at war's end, notably the familiar story of April 2nd, 1865, when a delivered message roused Jefferson Davis from Sunday services ahead of advancing Union troops. The evacuation of the Confederate government began at our doorstep. In the aftermath of the war, white Richmonders faced a hollowed-out economy and an upended social structure. Free African Americans poured into the city from the countryside, joining thousands already here in search of food, shelter, and work. Here they embraced new opportunities in education and also in exercising the right to vote. In 1866, William McFarland spoke to a gathering of freedmen on the eve of their first eligibility at the polls. While wishing them well, he noted, quote, emancipation has not been a blessing invariably on whom it's been bestowed. He warned, if you be moral, industrious, and economical, you'll be all right. But if you are idle, profligate, seditious, and yield to wicked counsels, your last condition will be worse than the first. In voting, he advised, follow citizens of the white race whom you have known long. Bishop John Johns told the diocese in 1866 that the freed people's character, quote, depends on their moral and religious education, for which a large measure of responsibility must rest upon us. And in the meantime, quote, forbearance to errors occasioned by extravagant notions of liberty. So while acknowledging the end of slavery, McFarland and Johns sought to reinforce the entrenched concept of race hierarchy. Whites would provide and command, and blacks would serve and defer, certainly not aspire to political or social equality. In the postbellum years, the Diocese of Virginia upheld an earlier edict for, quote, separate and distinct colored congregations. In truth, freedmen preferred other denominations. There were very few black Episcopalians in the entire state. 1880 enumerated only 200 communicants and 2 clergymen. Parochial reports for white parishes documented no, quote, colored members. Yet we know that there were visitors. St. Paul's vestry minutes in 1887 reaffirmed segregation, instructing the sexton that black people must sit in the West Gallery and that they, quote, are not permitted seats in the body of the church for any occasion. The diocese responded to the dwindling demographics with concern, and in 1884 opened up the Bishop Payne Divinity School for black seminarians, and before centuries in, a dozen clergy were ordained. Still, the number of African American congregants grew slowly under new policies that marginalized their churches into missionary districts and drastically limited their representation at annual council. Black clergymen like George Freeman Bragg and James Solomon Russell argued passionately against these changes, but white churchmen, while expressing utmost friendship, ignored them. The move had the effect of driving away both clergy and laity for generations to come. Moreover, the Protestant Episcopal Church crafted similar modes of segregation at their 1907 General Convention here in Richmond. A few years earlier, W.E.B. Du Bois summed up the situation dryly. Quote, although the Episcopal Church was the first American church to receive Negro members, it probably has done less for black people than any other aggregation of Christians. In political matters, in the Commonwealth, African Americans initially had more success. After Reconstruction in the late 1870s, they participated in the Readjuster Party, a coalition of whites and blacks established around the issue of public debt and education. Conservative Democrats pushed back with an explicit campaign to rid politics of black voters and office holders. Among the Democratic leaders was St. Paul's communicant Archer Anderson, Tredegar Scion, and prominent Confederate veteran. In 1883, he co-authored a paper justifying the shooting of several unarmed black men in Danville. Violence broke out in that South Side city from a perceived slight when a black pedestrian stumbled into a white man. In his published response, Anderson blamed the ensuing riot on readjuster influence, claiming that, quote, the colored race, inflamed by ambitious demagogues, had become rude and insulting to whites. The Danville incident marked a turning point. The threat of violence kept black voters from the polls, and conservative Democrats seized control of the government, a one-party monopoly that would last another 86 years. Conservative ascendancy, coupled with the Supreme Court's Plessy versus Ferguson decision instituting a separate but equal doctrine, led to the rewriting of Virginia's Constitution in 1902. St. Paul's members, Otway Allen and Eppa Hunton Jr., were delegates to that convention, and William Anderson served as the first Attorney General responsible for implementing its provisions. The new Constitution reinforced white supremacy by effectively disenfranchising most African Americans through new poll taxes and tests. These racial dynamics played out alongside rising lost cause sentiment, through which white Southerners recast Civil War memory. Through speeches, sermons, and text, an idealized narrative emerged that transformed bitter defeat into a righteous crusade and personal grief into a proud celebration of the Confederacy. This potent ideology had several generally held tenets, including a nostalgia for the antebellum past in which slavery was remembered as a benign institution, which, it was further emphasized, played no role in the start of the war. Often employing the language of Christianity, the Lost Cause also took on religious overtones in which Confederate leaders, particularly Lee, Davis, and Jackson, were venerated as saints. The Lost Cause was made physically manifest in a wave of monument building between the 1890s and the 1920s. Notably, on May 29, 1890, over 10,000 Richmonders witnessed the unveiling of the Lee Monument. The massive equestrian statue was erected on land donated by St. Paul's communicant Otway Allen. Rector Emeritus Minnegroda gave the invocation, and parishioner Archer Anderson delivered the keynote. 1890 also marked the transformation of St. Paul's Sanctuary. For its first 45 years, this space remained relatively unchanged. In keeping with early Virginia Episcopalian low church aesthetics, its white walls remained bare and its windows clear glass. That year, having deepened the chancel, the church installed its first memorial stained glass windows here. In response to the death of Jefferson Davis the previous December, the vestry also announced its intent to, quote, perpetuate the memory of both Davis and Lee with additional windows. These were in place by 1898, the Lee windows featuring images of Moses, the Davis windows picturing St. Paul and attendant angels. With their installation alongside related plaques, the church positioned itself as a participant in the broader movement to memorialize the Confederacy. As early as 1870, guidebooks directed tourists to the church to gaze on the pews where the Confederate leaders once sat. By century's end, the Lee and Davis windows lent new intensity to the site's war associations and prompted the vestry to institute an endowment to maintain the building as a historic site. Over time, St. Paul's Confederate identity became its salient characteristic, and it gained colorful appellations in the popular press. The church was described variously as the South's Westminster, its Mecca, its shrine, and more consistently after the 1920s, the Church of the Confederacy. On April 16, 1905, a metaphorical monument was laid at the chancel of St. Paul's, intangible but lasting nonetheless. It was an anecdote about Lee, published in the Times-Dispatch, recounted by Colonel T.L. Brune, a visitor from West Virginia. He stated that 40 years earlier, he had witnessed a, quote, tall, well-dressed Negro come to the communion table ahead of the congregation. Startled parishioners remained in their seats, quote, deeply chagrined at this attempt of the federal authorities to offensively humiliate them. General Lee, Brune continued, walked to the chancel rail and knelt not far from where the Negro was. Other congregants then went forward for communion. Brune added, quote, by this action of General Lee, the services were concluded as if the Negro had not been present. It was a grand exhibition of superiority shown by a true Christian and a great soldier under the most trying, offensive circumstances. The article was reprinted shortly afterwards in the Confederate Veteran magazine. Slight edits had the church members chagrined at this, quote, attempt by the new regime to offend and humiliate them. In 2000, history professor and St. Paul's communicant Phil Schwartz carefully researched the story for a paper he delivered at Stratford Hall, Lee's birthplace. He discovered no corroborating accounts of the incident in 1865 or afterwards. And taking into account the harsh language of the narrator and the date of its publication, that being in the wake of the 1902 Constitution debates, Lee's exhibition of superiority was likely commemorated as a model for rendering invisible those who overstep boundaries. Narratives have their own life. And as the 20th century unfolded, the anecdote took on a redemptive quality in which Lee's actions exemplified racial reconciliation.
A moment to pause in prayer before reflection. The Lord be with you. And also with you. Let us pray. O God, you made us in your own image and redeemed us through Jesus, your Son. Look with compassion on the whole human family. Take away the arrogance and hatred which infect our hearts. Break down the walls that separate us. Unite us in bonds of love. And work through our struggle and confusion to accomplish your purposes on earth, that in your good time all nations and races may serve you in harmony around your heavenly throne. Through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen.
So at this point, we're going to hear from our commenters a few minutes. So turn it over to y'all.
Good evening, everyone. It's indeed wonderful that this congregation and this community calls on its history. It is a history that is not tragic, that is not painful, it is the everyday. Often we try to use particular terms, this painful past or this tragic history, and that estranges us from the very everydayness of it. It is how folks understood each and every day they existed. The question for us is, how do we develop the frameworks, the narratives, the language to understand how we can create a society built on the dehumanization of a people? In many ways, what we've heard thus far is a narrative that suffers from an epistemic silence, a narrative that can't possibly think the voice of enslaved Africans, nominally free Africans, and still nominally free African Americans in the post-emancipation period. An epistemic silence that is constitutive of the very enterprise of how we understand history. Because history reminds us we must provide evidence. But what counts as the evidence? How do the archives silence African Americans? It is not by chance. It is not by happenstance. It is by very design. Because in a sense, the narrative to which we must ascend or the narrative to which we must construct must be one that has to deal with the very materiality of how you can create a society where its majority white citizens do not have a requirement to know anything about black humanity. This epistemic silence then enables or facilitates an ethical erasure. An ethical erasure that operates by the categories that don't contaminate one another. Christianity and slavery. We treat them as if they are antithetical. We treat them as if one is all good and unscathed and unsullied by the very materiality of life, and the other is too dirty, too awful, too tragic to contaminate by our religion. In reality, Christianity as practiced and it's embodied in the rituals, theologies, and the very existence of this church is slavery. It isn't something that's separated from it. It is constitutive of it. Theology is not something that comes to us from above, but theology is built into the very fabric of our everyday lives. That's how you make sense of dehumanization, because it is normal, it is acceptable, it is the right way of things. So the same way we have to decolonize our history, we have to decolonize our theology. It is not a theology that is something about Christianity that's good. It is a Christianity that's in the service of colonialism and a Christianity in service of slavery. It is not something external from it. It is the very essence of the ideology of white supremacy. And lastly, we got to begin to think of, how do we embody white supremacy? It is not something where we find our enslaved segregated in some balcony up in the stairs, up in this balcony of this church. It is not something where we begin to think of it as something abject or other. It is constitutive of how we understand the everyday. And so what we ask is one question: what happens to a people who forgets their Holocaust? What happens to a nation where the crime is so immense it can't even deal with it? That's what chattel slavery is. That's what we are dealing with. And in many ways, our narratives, our languages, our conceptual frameworks are inadequate to the task of grappling with the enormity of this crime. And even our theological languages and categories find themselves inept in the moment where a group of people can be conceptually and materially dehumanized. Those are my initial comments and thoughts.
That's quite a bit to let sink in and to settle in this conversation. And I too want to express my thanks for being included in this conversation, and what an honor it is to really participate in what is an excavation, right? An excavation work of looking at this history of racism and the race that this church built. And so I just want to sort of approach this from the perspective of how we can start to unearth some of those new narratives and new ways of thinking about this history. And I'm particularly interested in the early discussions about pro-slavery Christianity, and as Dr. Walker has pointed out, that pro-slavery Christianity melded Christianity and white supremacy in such a fashion that it became the way that this church operated. It became the way that the people in this church navigated not only their relationships with whatever enslaved and free Black people would have been here, but also with the people who worked for them, the enslaved people who they owned. And in particular, I'm interested in us thinking a little bit more about this question of race, and what is it that, excuse me, the relationships between the people of St. Paul's who were slave owners, who were the initiators of industrial slavery in the city, what did they do in their lives outside of the church? Because I think one of the things that comes through is that there's not necessarily a clear history of Black people in the church or enslaved people in the church. And so what that means is then we have to look at the relationships outside, right? And that those are the places where we can start to see how it is that former slaveholders came to think of themselves not just as carrying on an institution that was biblical, but that it was an institution that was ordained in terms of the relations, the hierarchical relationships between Black and white people. So it's important to look at those relationships outside of the church. I also want to underscore the idea of race, again, as this construct, as this a binary, right? We tend to think about race as sort of thinking about Black people and thinking about the constructions of Blackness. But I think that this conversation also invites us to think about the constructions of white supremacy and to think about the ideas that sort of uphold this notion of white people as already and always already the protectors and always already good, and how that becomes part of the narrative that has to be deconstructed. I think along those lines, and I hope we'll get, and the follow-up discussion too, to think a little bit about the relationship between religion and power or politics is something that is evident in the early parts of the narrative where members of this church participated in the Secession Convention. They participated in the 1902 Convention. There's a long legacy of the intersections between leadership and city government and state government and membership in this church. And so I think it's important to consider how is it that this church could be a site of power, both in terms of spiritual power, but also in terms of political power, and how does that, how that was sort of lived out in the public realm. I mean, it's the stories that's been told so far makes me think about, well, how is it that these people who were charged with, sort of writing constitutions and defining the rights of the people in the state worshiped in this church? And how did they worship? What were the ideals that they sort of upheld as a community together? And how did those ideals either make their way up to the sort of governmental level, or how did what happened in this church sort of not make its way? And so hopefully, sort of thinking a little bit more about the theological legacy of the church in the world will be something else that comes out of this conversation.
I knew it was a mistake to go last, and I'm looking furtively around for the teleprompter that my two colleagues seem to have used to structure their great comments. I'm afraid I don't see it. I'd like to address something that each of them said, and we still see echoes of it today. How was it that people who claimed to be masters, who claimed ownership of the society, could square their faith with their actions? And they did it, as Chris said, by thinking of faith and its consequences as an individual matter. That if you were a good master, if you were kind and only had your enslaved property whipped when they really needed it for smoking a cigar or so forth, you could live with yourself because you were thinking of yourself as a good, kind person within the bounds of your own faith. And you were adhering to the admonitions of the Bible, to be a firm patriarch, to be kind and generous when you could, but to know when you needed to exert your power. And we see that is still the way that we are thinking about it today. How many of the conversations that we're having about the statues in Richmond are about the character of the individuals who are enshrined in that bronze and granite? Is if Stonewall Jackson leading a Sunday school class for Black children, or Robert E. Lee doing what he did or may not have done, is often brought up as a part of the rationale of why it's permissible and even honorific to have statues to these men, because they were good Christians. They were good individual Christians. And in both the cases of slave owners who thought of their responsibilities only in personal terms, so do people think of the leaders of the Confederacy and of the people who led disfranchisement only in personal terms, thinking about their motivations rather than the consequences of their acts. Did it matter what Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson were really like if we know that if they and their cause had won, it would have been the creation of a vast nation based on perpetual bondage? And so by looking at the individual story, by individualizing faith and divorcing it from social consequence, we miss the people that we're talking about. Now, if I might seize a moment to talk about another church and to broaden the evidence and to talk about the African American people who did find a church, something I've thought about is I was the 9th president of the University of Richmond. The first president of the university was also the state-appointed minister for First African Baptist Church, because you could not have black people worshiping unsupervised by themselves. And in his memoir, he talks pretty effectively about he recognized that he was not actually wanted in the church. And he actually had to pass rules that people could not be late coming in because they would wait until he had finished speaking and come in. And he said there was a provision against black preaching, but there was no provision against black praying. So he said some of the deacons would give quite long and involved prayers that were warmly received. So, as we're thinking about the ways that people actually navigated this, white people often navigated it by individualizing it and isolating it and its consequences. Black people often lived with it by seizing whatever opportunities they could to express their faith and their fellowship with one another. And to see these things played out gets us to the very heart of this fundamental problem at the heart of American history. And for this congregation to do the work that it's doing is remarkable. If we had this conversation all across the country, we'd be a step closer toward getting over the amnesia that we've talked about here. Thank you.
Thank you all. That was great. I really want to talk even more with all.
But there's more history to come,
stuff.
right?
But there's more history. The unexpected stuff. In 1912, the vestry called Walter Russell Bowie to the rectorship at St. Paul's. The 27-year-old priest challenged this church to be what he called a democratic, missionary, and working church. Did they want it to represent a real welcome and concern for human beings, whatever their backgrounds may have been, he asked them? Would it try to be a dynamo of power for all the church's missionary service everywhere? Bowie had been trained in what we call the social gospel, a conviction that living a Christian faith required believers to address problems of poverty, public health, and residential conditions created by modern industrialized societies. The social gospel originated in places like New York and Boston, but it spread in the moderate vanguard of mainline Protestant American churches in the 20th century. 16 years after Plessy versus Ferguson enshrined separate but equal in federal law, and 10 years after Virginia disfranchised black men in 1902, white people moved forward, comfortable in their self-defined role as benevolent superiors, and from that position devoted themselves to redefining what improved race relations meant within the confines of Jim Crow. In the process, St. Paul's people actively shaped the 20th century geography of race relations in modern Richmond, often in unexpected ways. Slavery featured control of African Americans through intimate personal relations and the threat of legally sanctioned violence. The post-emancipation period shifted the struggles over the ballot box. The early 20th century's focus, after the 1902 Constitution, was on managing white supremacy in public spaces of a modern urban industrial city. So these struggles took place in hospitals, homes, jobs, transportation, parks, and schools. Mary Cook Mumford is the dominant and emblematic figure of this generation at St. Paul's. Daughter of a Confederate veteran and widow of Virginia's most influential lost cause historian, Mary Cook is best known for founding the Richmond Education Association and for advocating the acceptance of women to the University of Virginia. Mumford was a leading figure in interracial programs in Richmond in the 1910s and 1920s, including organizations such as the Negro Organizing Society, the Community House for Negro People, the Virginia Industrial School for Colored Girls, and the Richmond Urban League. And she sat on all the boards, on biracial boards of all these organizations. All of these organizations were dedicated to bringing together local white leaders and local black leaders to talk over and develop plans for addressing problems of residential overcrowding, poverty, alcoholism, disease, and lack of educational opportunities that plagued African American neighborhoods. And if you are thinking that these things might have arisen from racism and segregation itself, you're seeing the irony and anticipating the shortcomings here. Munford and her generation leaned hard on the lost cause history of happy and loyal slaves, and what that history described as familial bonds between white and black people. She celebrated this relationship and the work of biracial committees after 1902 at the 1916 fundraising launch for a memorial hospital expansion, creating a separate facility for black Richmonders, by noting that, quote, "Nothing in the past decade has occurred to make us see the solidarity of the human race more than movements of this kind. They show us that we are our brother's keeper. It is indeed the call of old Black Joe, I'm coming." It's cringeworthy to our ears. But Mumford insisted that material, if not political and social equity, did matter. That's conventional racial liberalism for Virginia at the turn of the 20th century. But she and others at St. Paul's in the social gospel generation took it a step further by seeing it as their Christian duty to sit down together in brotherhood to talk, listen, and apply public policy solutions to contemporary problems, especially where they intersected with race. I don't know what the subjects of Mary Cook's paternalism thought in private, but Maggie Walker's newspaper, perhaps playing the paternalist game itself, publicly declared that Mumford, quote, "belongs to that distinctive group that the colored people of the South call real white people." Richmond's population exploded in the 1910s, and overcrowding and substandard housing became the city's most pressing problems, particularly in black neighborhoods. Black families sought better houses and services by seeking the purchase of homes in traditionally white neighborhoods. In 1912, the city passed its first residential segregation ordinance that legally prevented black home and property purchases on predominantly white blocks. Proponents of residential segregation cited the necessity of protecting property values and respectability of good white neighborhoods. When a black Methodist congregation proposed purchasing a white church at 5th and Lee Streets, many white people charged them with a desire to, quote, "injure the interest of the white property owners and practically to ruin a district, which is now exceedingly desirable," in part because St. Paul's church home, this church's orphanage, was nearby. They were successful, and St. Paul's member George Anderson enforced the city's segregation ordinance to prevent the sale. Anderson actually urged the city to drop the ordinance as impractical, and it was later declared unconstitutional. But laws implementing Jim Crow had only just begun. Mumford, Russell Bowie, Beverly Tucker, Bowie's successor, and congregant Richard Carrington regularly spoke against the trend toward legal segregation in the early 20th century. They told the city government, which included St. Paul's members like Alderman Graham Hobson and Mayor David Richardson, that segregation ordinances were a hostile affront to black people, who they assured everyone respected segregation by tradition without help from the law. Mumford noted that these laws, quote, "would work a hardship on the Negroes in forcing them to live in great congestion in narrow and constricted areas." They articulated a belief that the city could prevent black movement by providing equal roads, equal housing, equal sewer and power, equal recreation facilities, and equal education in black neighborhoods, and they genuinely worked toward it through interracial dialogue and policy proposals. The most remarkable avenue for such work was through the Commission on Interracial Cooperation. The CIC was founded in Atlanta in 1919 to promote dialogue between black leaders and moderate white leaders in the wake of post-World War I riots, and to prevent the potential radicalization of black leaders by the NAACP. Richmond's branch of the CIC began in 1920 with an ecumenical group of churchwomen, including Mumford, with Kate Pleasance Minor and Kate Pleasance Minor's sister, Rosalie Archer, both of St. Paul's, and the organization quickly gained traction among male religious and business leaders. Bowie, Mumford, Beverly Tucker, and others were stalwarts of the CIC in the 1920s and 1930s, but St. Paul's member Richard Carrington became the chairman of the Richmond and Virginia chapters, leading their search, in Carrington's words, for ways to, quote, make more adequate provision for the Negro in education, public health, child welfare, recreation, and general living conditions. The Richmond CIC carried out this mission with studies of housing in 1925 and a 1927 study of the way public transportation negatively impacted black Richmonders. The CIC regularly met in this church's parish house, and Beverly Tucker continued to place this church at the center of interracial dialogue in the 1930s by promoting and hosting an annual event called Race Relations Day. In 1929, St. Paul's invited the commission to host a biracial service in this sanctuary, featuring Tuskegee Institute President Robert Moton as speaker. In a reminder that they had limits on their thinking about fellowship, the vestry voted unanimously to hold the event, but were careful to instruct that the pews be segregated, white to one side of the aisle, black to the other. But considering the usual relegation of blacks to the West Gallery, they likely considered this move rather progressive. This interracial cooperation emboldened Bowie and Tucker to condemn racial violence and intimidation. Bowie denounced the Ku Klux Klan from this pulpit when it marched in Richmond in 1920 and again in 1921, saying that, quote, there is danger in the South that these influences should embitter the relationship between the white and colored peoples, and that shortcuts of lawlessness should take the place of a patient search for Christian cooperation, which is the only way by which a solution of any human problem can be found. This is a quintessential blend of paternalistic racial thinking with a progressive, pragmatic policy approach to attacking social problems, which marks this long period between the 1902 Constitution and the Civil Rights Movement. The Klan never prospered in Richmond. Vocal white supremacists, however, channeled their energies into Anglo-Saxon clubs. Anglo-Saxon clubs were premised on the idea of racial integrity, that ethnicities possessed certain traits that could be diluted in contact with inferior ethnic groups. At their core, Anglo-Saxon clubs feared most of all racial mixing, sexual mixing, and they backed the notorious 1924 Racial Integrity Act and the 1927 Massenburg Bill intended to physically separate white people from non-white people. This stood in direct contrast to the type of interracial dialogue that Mumford and Carrington advocated. These laws passed, but not without the objections of Carrington and the CIC, who claimed that they would harm black people more than they would help white people. St. Paul's members continued to shape Richmond's racial geography. For instance, Randolph Williams served as a policy advisor to the mayor's office as the city tackled the problem of concentrated poverty during the Great Depression. As federal money became available through the New Deal, Richmond officials looked to what they called slum clearance, the destruction of black neighborhoods and construction of new public housing. Though federal money fell through, these plans were the germ of what became Richmond public housing, starting with Gilpin Court just after World War II. In the meantime, St. Paul's during this period nurtured its connection to the Confederacy through regular observances of Lee's and Davis's birthday, the annual flying of Confederate flags, and self-promotion in tourism literature as the church where Lee and Davis worshiped. This nostalgia absolutely boosted their sense of paternalistic obligation in regard to race relations. But we see a subtle evolution in their theology. They no longer insisted that God created inequality and that God demanded a web of mutual obligation to manage it. Bowie's social gospel that demanded Christian action on social ills saw human solutions to what he called human problems. But they still recognized and perpetuated the social reality of racial differences. And as they pushed for an idealistic but impossible version of separate but equal, they never challenged the fundamental assumptions of white supremacy, and their moderation did nothing to alleviate the ongoing damage of segregation. It was still a long generation before they learned to combine a colorblind theology with a secular recognition of universal human rights during and after the Civil Rights Movement. We're still in the middle of that transition in the 1920s, and as lost cause paternalism blended with the social gospel, it ever so slowly afforded slender opportunities for new kinds of racial relations. And their actions, I believe, contributed to segregation's erosion and eventual dismantling, starting from the outside, but by a later generation. You can see the breakdown of this system by the late 1930s. In the years immediately before World War II, the CIC became defunct as black leaders became disillusioned by white moderation and inability to address the root causes of inequality. Those leaders stepped beyond the comfort zone of white racial liberals and began demanding voting rights and political equality, direct action that liberal paternalists, while accustomed to interracial dialogue, were not comfortable with because they could not manage it on their own terms. As a sign of the changes, in the mid-1930s, one black Richmonder reported his private opinion of Mary Cook Mumford. She was, he said, quote, one of those liberals willing to work for Negroes, but not to work with Negroes. Breaking the paternalistic framework forced religious racial liberals like those at St. Paul's into defensiveness and cautious reaction.
On Sunday, November 11th, 1945, following the close of the Second World War, St. Paul's gathered here to celebrate its centennial. That morning, Confederate flags marked the Lee and Davis pews. Rector Vincent Franks and Bishop Frederick Goodwin presided, but gave the pulpit over to former Rector Beverly Tucker, now Bishop of Ohio. He acknowledged St. Paul's historic past, but focused primarily on the recent somber lessons of global conflict. The war has destroyed our provincial conceptions, he stated, and we've been made to accept that the world is one. The church is commissioned to carry its good news to all peoples without respect to race or color as the saving spirit, without which all political efforts will be in vain. He was, of course, speaking about the state of the war-torn world, but his message implicitly alluded to the enduring segregation that still undercut the democratic and Christian ideals of this nation. Over the next 25 years, the gap between those ideals and institutionalized racism became sharply evident. The painful, bloody battles of the civil rights movement transformed the United States. These years also transformed the people of St. Paul's as they witnessed dramatic changes in federal and state laws, the policies of the U.S. Episcopal Church and the Diocese of Virginia, as well as the shifting dynamics within their own parish. The National Church took its first cautious steps of integrating its conventions and seminaries, and in 1952 resolved to oppose discrimination. 2 years later, it joined other mainline denominations in affirming the Supreme Court's Brown versus Board of Education ruling. The Diocese of Virginia had begun revising its own policies. In 1949, it granted equal status to African American clergy and laity, leaving segregation untouched, a half measure in a commonwealth with Jim Crow laws intact, and one that would soon wage massive resistance against integration. St. Paul's records document little to no official engagement with civil rights issues in the 1950s. While its charitable donations largely served white beneficiaries, sporadic offerings were made to, quote, colored work overseen by the diocese. Otherwise, the church was generally disengaged, a fact noted in 1957 by former Rector Russell Bowie, who despaired of Virginia's massive resistance. He wrote, "Even the people of my beloved St. Paul's, who in the earlier years had become standard bearers for liberal thought and positive purpose, for the most part dropped back into reaction." Outside the church, St. Paul's people continued to shape the racial landscape of Richmond. For instance, vestryman Thomas Bryan and Thomas Bouchard were instrumental in the implementation of the city's master plan for urban renewal. A crucial feature was the construction of the Richmond-Petersburg Turnpike, which cut an 18-block swath through Richmond's central black neighborhood, displacing nearly 10,000 citizens. St. Paul's vestrymen also played key roles in legal fights to uphold the status quo. Attorney Archibald Robertson represented Prince Edward County's defense of school segregation, and George Gibson was lead attorney for the Commonwealth in its bid to uphold the poll tax. Both lost in landmark Supreme Court rulings. In 1959, the diocese began addressing integration by forming a racial study commission. Among its appointees were St. Paul's members Mary Tyler Cheek and Eppa Hunton IV. Cheek, the daughter of newsman and Lee biographer Douglas Southall Freeman, urged respectful dialogue between the races. She wrote, "Social change is as inevitable as it is slow. Growth is painful, but it cannot be stopped because it is the essence of life." Eppa Hunton, on the other hand, endorsed the 1860 diocesan policy of separate and distinct congregations. Noting the absence of Black communicants at St. Paul's, he went on to question why a Black man would want to join a white church where he would not be welcomed, and suggested that integration for integration's sake would not be, quote, in true Christian spirit, as it would lead to schism, which would benefit no one. In the wake of that commission, the diocese began integrating its camps and schools. St. Paul's vestryman Robert Gordon served as president of the board at St. Catherine's when the school accepted its first Black applicant in 1962. By 1968, all 9 of the diocesan-sponsored schools were integrated. And so were new programs housed at St. Paul's. Rector Joseph Heaston oversaw the campaign for a new parish hall and parking garage, which opened in 1960. Expansion meant more capacity for outreach. By the end of the decade, the church sponsored a school for young deaf children and a development center for disabled adults, both including African American clients. Federal civil rights legislation in the mid-1960s offered legal clarity, but reaction to it amplified racial division. There were also growing tensions between Southern Episcopalians and a progressive national church that firmly supported the movement. In 1965, against a landscape of freedom rides, bombings, and mass demonstrations, presiding Bishop John Hines urged Episcopalians to, quote, speak up loud and clear. Under Bishop Hines, the National Church established the General Convention's special program in 1967. The initiative set aside $9 million to be distributed as empowerment grants to Black grassroots organizations in America's cities. Breaking a pattern of paternalism, they allowed the recipients to decide how to best apply the funds in their own communities. From the start, the endeavor was viewed as a radical step. When Virginia's Bishop Goodwin gave full support to the special program, angry conservatives began withholding pledges in protest of the urban initiative, and more broadly in delayed backlash against the church's civil rights involvement. This prompted a financial crisis for this diocese and others, and ultimately for the national church. St. Paul's next rector, John Shelby Spong, arrived in the midst of this controversy in the fall of 1969. From his first day, he proved to be a challenging leader during challenging times. Addressing the issue straight on, Spong delivered a detailed defense of the special program to his new congregation. It was convincing. In following weeks, a transcript of his address was published as a full-page newspaper ad under the banner, "A Letter to All Episcopalians," and it was signed by prominent Richmond laity, half of them St. Paul's communicants, including Buford Scott. Change came fast. Within his first 3 months, Spong also convinced the vestry to halt the tradition of flying a Confederate battle flag on Lee and Davis's birthdays, convinced that the banner, quote, represented slavery and segregation. The signature initiative of the Spong era was Isaiah 58:12, a grant program inspired by the General Convention Special Program. With funding from parking garage revenues, the church provided seed money for community projects aimed at alleviating poverty and discrimination. Through the 1970s, Isaiah helped launch several projects, including a medical clinic in the Fulton neighborhood and a street academy for high school dropouts. Jack Spong's impact on St. Paul's was significant. His energetic and blunt focus on race relations emboldened parishioners to look squarely at the damaging legacy of racism and to embrace social activism as an important part of Christian ministry. With his departure in 1976, the church drafted a parish profile that left no question about the church's progressive direction. Its concluding paragraph used the word risk 3 times in describing its investment of energy, capital, and reputation. Craig Biddle arrived from Connecticut willing to take up the challenge, and under his rectorship, outreach grew apace, notably through the Downtown Cooperative Ministry, a consortium of inner-city churches he co-founded. Through DCM, St. Paul's began its Thursday lunch program as a part of walk-in ministry to the homeless. It was clear, however, that charitable enterprise alone couldn't ease the city's mounting racial tension. Multi-layered issues exacerbated divisions in the 1970s. Voting rights litigation over an annexation scheme, court-ordered school desegregation implemented by busing, and rampant white flight to the suburbs. Against this roiling backdrop, Biddle developed the Richmond Urban Institute to help decrease polarization. Housed at and mostly funded by St. Paul's, the Institute opened in 1979, and it had a racially balanced council and was headed by a black and a white commissioner, one of them, the Reverend Benjamin Campbell. Through the 1980s, the think tank sponsored forums and developed programs such as addressing youth employment and economic development. Funding challenges closed the Institute in 1990, but it proved enormously influential in shaping other significant endeavors that sought to heal racial divides. Of those, I can only touch on a few. While not official programs of the church, they grew organically from the creative energy of the parish. Moreover, St. Paul's people were their founders, and many have served and still do on their boards. A direct offshoot of the Institute, the Richmond Urban Forum, was led by the formidable Mary Tyler Cheek. She and prominent African-American pastor Jim Leary formed a supper club to bridge the social gap and create networks between Richmond's white and black community leaders. Mary Tyler also founded the Better Housing Coalition with Carter McDowell, which still coordinates regional housing nonprofits. The coalition has funded major litigation against financial institutions that discriminate through redlining. In the late In the late 1980s, Ben Campbell first envisioned the need for, quote, a place of prayer in the middle of this desperate city. While serving as St. Paul's priest in residence, he led a campaign to transform an empty 19th century monastery into Richmond Hill, an ecumenical retreat which sponsors interracial dialogue. Rob and Susan Corcoran gained crucial support from these networks, and in 1990, Rob launched Hope in the Cities, which fosters reconciliation between racial, ethnic, and religious groups. Hope in the City and Richmond Hill were also instrumental in the formation of the city's Slave Trail Commission. St. Paul's 14th rector, Robert Hetherington, was and remains a participant in many of these programs, and when he arrived in 1984, his quiet manner was welcomed by parishioners. Still, this classmate of civil rights martyr Jonathan Daniels proved deeply committed to racial equality. During Hetherington's long tenure, St. Paul's continued its steady transformation. By the turn of the millennium, it was no longer a shrine to the South, but a church, quote, proclaiming Christ in the heart of the city. 1987 brought two significant benchmarks for the church. Ruby Martin, former civil rights director in the Johnson administration, was elected St. Paul's first Black vestry member. The Martin family joined St. Paul's a decade earlier, part of a small but steady influx of African American members. And Rodney Rice, Yale Divinity School grad, served his diaconate as the church's first Black clergyman. By the late 1990s, consensus formed that St. Paul's needed to rethink the direction of its social ministry. Instead of sending dozens of small grants to various endeavors, there was a yearning to focus resources on a single project that could make a difference. After a year of exploration, the church launched the Micah Initiative. At its core, Micah is a partnership with Woodville Elementary, an at-risk Black majority school. Under the leadership of Ruby Martin, Buford Scott, Betsy Carr, and Nan Ellen Rich, implementation proceeded carefully, guided foremost by the expressed needs of the Woodville staff. The initiative fully commenced in the fall of 2000 when close to 50 parishioners engaged as tutors to students and aides to teachers and families. Their guiding motto became changing the world one relationship at a time. The effort flourished, and working with Richmond Hill spread throughout the city. Today, Micah involves more than 120 faith communities and 24 elementary schools. With Micah, we sped past the year 2000, the end point of tonight's summary. That's our stopping place, simply because our research is still in process. We're looking forward to documenting the 21st century chapter of St. Paul's racial history. I'll let former Bishop Peter Lee have the last words. In 1996, he commended the congregation, quote, "A church needs to have a double focus, a place where people can worship and a place where faith is lived out through work in the community. St. Paul's could easily have become an inward-looking museum, but it's a stable, solid, beautiful church, a place for all people."
I guess I'd like to start and pick up on 2 points. 2 points, one by Nicole and one by Ed. The notion of privatized piety. What we see is we want to be very careful of constructing a narrative of ascension. It is that we've arrived. In many ways, what we want to do is trouble the waters. How do we continue some of the same practices we see in the 19th century under new categories in the 20th century? One way in which to understand that is through the notion of a privatized piety, meaning I can be as religious and as Christian inside of this space, but it then commits me to nothing outside of this space. I don't have to risk anything. I don't have to revise my theological categories and constructs. Instead, they can remain the same. And then I can operationalize my privatized piety when I treat people as problems, as pathologies to be solved through public policy. The question for the church through this narrative is, how do we understand what it means to be human in the world? Can we see humanity, not in someone who's racialized as other, but can you see humanity in the very blackness of black people? In a sense, that's a different question. That's the question around race. Race allows us to externalize a phenomena. It allows us to begin to project around a notion of race relations. In Virginia, it was good, race relations management. That's how we have to do it. We just manage these races. That's it. At Virginia Union, there was one famous sociology professor, Gordon Blaine Hancock, who received funding for the Torrance School of Race Relations to manage race relations. But the key question is, can I see the humanity in black people? Not, oh, I don't see your race, I don't see your blackness, I just see someone else. Don't erase that, no. But how do I begin to decolonize the very idea and notion of what it means to be human in the world, such that I can see humanity in all of its variety and all of its diversity and in the depth of its complexity? That's what this church is facing. In many ways, we can externalize it to programs, we can externalize it to everything that we do for social justice out there. But in many ways, what the history is calling us to do is to say that, yes, we're doing good work out there. How do we then decolonize the theology in here? How do we begin to think that God has created us in the deep diversity of who we are? And now we must begin to fundamentally rethink what it means to be human and our idea of who's human. I'll end with this note. W.E.B. Du Bois began the first chapter of the first essay of his 1903 classic, The Souls of Black Folk. He ends that first essay with this question. To the real question, how does it feel to be a problem? I seldom answer a word. Du Bois refuses categorically the very idea that black humanity is a problem, it is a pathology, or it is something to be solved by public policy. He doesn't argue for his humanity. His humanity is given. And in many ways, can we develop a church community that then understands that the humanity of all of God's creation is something that is given, not argued for, something that doesn't require a program or policy. It requires a commitment to the deep humanity that God has created. That could be the challenge from this history. Can we see the humanity in all of us?
Hi, I wanted to build on that clarion call to recognize the full humanity of all people, of Black people in particular, and to underscore that part of what I see as part of the need to re-narrativize this community, and that this work is going towards constructing a new narrative. And I guess as I was sort of reflecting on the work that's going on here, I was reminded of a segment of Douglas Blackman's Slavery by Another Name, the documentary about convict leasing and how it became the new institution of the sort of new iteration of slavery in the United States. And there's a story of a Alabama mine owner in the early 20th century, and how he had pursued the men who had been convicts and released to his mine, and they were actually running away to try to pursue their freedom, and he found them and murdered them in cold blood. And the film has an interview with this miner's granddaughter. And she was first presented with this narrative of her grandfather's work because of the work that Douglas Blackman had done. prior to encountering black men, she had a narrative of her grandfather as a self-made man, somebody who, was an upstanding person in the community, someone who, in this particular instance, was trying to protect his business from workers who did not want to work. And so with this moment of sort of reckoning, this moment of a confrontation with a new narrative about who her grandfather was, she had to sort of grapple with, well, how do I make sense out of this other narrative, this story that is in fact the truth, that my grandfather basically enslaved black men in the 20th century, well after slavery had ended, that my grandfather killed these men in cold blood. And it produced all kinds of feelings of, guilt, of frustration, of confusion, of disappointment. And while we don't know what it is that this woman went on to do with the new narrative, the new understanding that she had, I feel like this church is in a moment of reckoning with the past, an opportunity to take that narrative, to take this narrative of the ways that St. Paul has engaged in reinforcing ideas of white supremacy under the cloak of sort of Christian theology, the way that members of this church have used the authority and the sort of power of this congregation in ways that didn't honor building greater opportunities and greater equality in society, and take that new narrative and that understanding to build a new narrative, and one that grapples deeply and directly with the history of white supremacy, and that through this excavation that there might be a exposing of a truth, and a truth that will allow true light to shine in. So.
Unlike my colleagues, I don't have a theology degree, so I'm not really fully equipped to launch out in what I'm getting ready to say, but it hasn't stopped me before. It's a problem to think about, what does it mean to look back on these people who were so obviously entangled in something larger than themselves, and in many ways worse than themselves? What do we do with the knowledge that Chris and Beth have shared with us today, the hard work, the recovering of evidence to tell us this story? I like to think that I'm morally superior to every dead person there is because they can't fight back. And I'm here now, and I can say whatever I want to say about them. But we know that that's not true. So what do we take from this hard-won knowledge and this hard knowledge? I think we take two things that are in the spirit of the faith practice in this church. One is humility. We're not better than these folks. We're living now, they lived then. Does that mean that there are no moral judgments to be made about history? Does that mean there are no moral judgments to be made about ourselves? I don't think so. But it does mean that we have to approach those questions with reflection that we ourselves embody what is called sin, from a secular perspective, what might be called lots of other things. But humility is not enough, because humility can just be immobilizing, to recognize that there's nothing that we can do. So what's the other lesson that we can draw from this? It's determination to do better. To determination to, within the constraints and the blindnesses that are bequeathed to us in our own time. We don't have to think very hard to think about what people 50 years from now coming together in this same space might say about us, about the sins to which we turned a blind eye, to the suffering that we ignored. So that doesn't mean that there's not a moral arc of justice. It doesn't mean that things can't get better. But it means that any honest approach to the past and to ourselves begins with the humility of knowing that we live in time, that we live with self-delusion, that we live with self-congratulation, and to do our best to acknowledge those things and to keep on anyway. Thanks.
Thank you, Corey, Nicole, Ed. Thank you for those comments. I really want to continue this conversation.